Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with the story, After the Fall, Part 3, penned by the twisted mind of Locked 334. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow fear fanatics and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us, so feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, After the Fall. Part 3. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. Winter was what they were not prepared for. Neither of them came from places that received much snow. By late December, the ground had been coated in white. The two boys found themselves making more frequent stops to rest. Their clothing was not adequate for this type of weather. Collin constantly cursed himself for not being prepared for this. Tony always tried to be his ray of hope. He assured Collin they would find better attire before it got too bad. Collin tried his best to believe his friend. But as the weeks passed, that small sliver of hope began to fade. They had been making poor time already. When they finally reached what should have been the northern portion of Ohio, they knew their map would be almost useless. The rising waters of the Great Lakes had engulfed most of Michigan. This turned the state line into a snow-coated beachside. They had been moving more west to avoid Columbus. Now, they had no choice but to continue in that direction and across Indiana. They had abandoned the bicycle long ago. The snow had risen too high to push through with the tires. Collin stopped at a sign that read, Keeshawau Country Cabins. His eyes were intent on the words. His will was spent, as was his body. Tony tapped him on the shoulder and asked what was wrong. But Collin simply stared at the sign. The wind stung his face. He could no longer feel his toes. They had spent almost 2 months walking through this. Now, they had only made it to Illinois. Collin knew that if they had to avoid major cities and the rising waters from the lakes, it would take them another few months before they reached Canada. He began to regret coming north. He started wishing he had just stayed home and tried to survive there.
Are you okay, man?
Tony nudged him again. Collin remembered why he kept going.
I'm cold and I'm tired.
No shit, so am I.
I think we should find one of these cabins, get a fire going, and hunker down. I don't think we can survive out here much longer.
Collin replied, barely taking notice of Tony's remark. Tony's eyes lit up at the thought of being warm for a while. He took off toward one of the log structures that remained at the camping ground. After a few attempts of finding an unlocked door and failing, Collin simply kicked the door in. They would have to board it shut, but at least they were inside. Tony rushed over to the fireplace. Seeing that whoever had stocked the cabin left enough wood to get it going, he began lighting kindling and grabbed for the first log. Collin surveyed the place. They had abandoned their normal caution for warmth, and he needed to make sure they were safe. The tiny cabin had a living room, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and 1 bathroom. Even if the facility was on a well, Collin knew the pipes would have frozen long ago. They would have to melt down snow over the fire to drink and bathe. The fridge was empty, but there were a few canned goods left in the small pantry. It wasn't much, but it was something. Tony yelled for Collin, letting him know the fire was ready. Collin grabbed a couple of blankets from the bedroom before joining his friend. They both stripped off their dripping coats, shoes, and socks. Then they laid in front of the fire as the sun went down. Tony asked what Collin's plan was from here, but he was silent for a moment.
Let's worry about that in the morning,
he finally replied before tossing Tony a thick comforter. Collin dreamt of lying in the old cornfield again, but this time Danny was right beside him. He turned, staring into his brother's eyes, and noticed malice within them. Danny asked why he had been forgotten so easily. Collin tried to explain through tears. He tried to tell him how sorry he was, and that Tony wasn't a replacement, that he could never replace him. The sky above turned dark and cold, the wind picking up rapidly. Collin looked up as snow began to cover his face. When he looked back, Danny's form was replaced with Tony's. His friend spoke.
Wake up, Collin.
Tony stood over Collin, shaking him, trying to get him to open his eyes. Collin's eyes remained shut, but he mumbled apologies over and over again. Tony felt his forehead. It was extremely warm, and sweat beaded upon it. The young boy could tell his friend was shaking despite how warm it felt. He knew that Collin must have a fever. The boy dug through their pack for the first aid kit. He found a small packet of aspirin before grabbing a bottle of water. He heaved Collin up from behind and pushed the pills between his friend's lips. His hand shook as he tried to pour the water in and get Collin to swallow, begging him to take the medicine. Through his fever-induced haze, Collin choked down the pills. Tony laid him down again and rushed to find a towel. He knew he had to bring down his temperature. For the next few days, Tony medicated his friend, tried to keep him comfortable, and gave as much water as Collin could swallow. They did not have any antibiotics. Tony could only hope Collin was strong enough to fight off whatever infection afflicted him. The boy was scared, but his friend had prepared him to survive. Tony had learned to shoot, track, hunt, and prepare food, which would come in handy as their stocks were running low. They had not seen many animals, but anything would do. When Collin's fever broke, Tony decided to go out to look for food. They only had a couple of cans of beans left, and he knew that wasn't enough. Collin would need real food once he woke up. Tony had found a winter coat in one of the bedrooms. It was a little big, but it would help keep him warm. He took the pistol, Collin's hunting knife, and the rifle as he set out into the endless mounds of white. The wind was harsh to his cheeks, but he knew he had no choice. Collin awoke 4 hours later, his head pounding as he scanned the room. A small sliver of paper had the words, "Gone hunting," scribbled upon it. This caused him to rush to his feet, knowing Tony should not be out there alone. But as soon as his feet came to the floor, he stumbled in his weakened state. His body crashed into the couch, sending pain throughout him. He screamed in agony, gagging and coughing in an effort to catch his breath. He called out for his friend, but unknown to him, Tony was at least a mile away. Tony sat covered in snow near a small bush. His eyes were trained on the slight movements of what appeared to be a snow rabbit. He had been waiting for hours, and this was his chance to bring home some meat. His finger pulled the trigger and the shot rang out just before the animal dropped over, lifeless. Tony let out a laugh of joy as he ran for his reward, grabbing hold of it and his knife. He quickly skinned and cleaned his kill before burying the unused portion. His feet dragged in the snow to cover up any trace of blood or his tracks as he made his way back to the cabin. When the boy stepped into the cabin, Collin almost tackled him in a hug. Collin was sure he had been hurt or taken while out hunting. He squeezed him so tight that it hurt his chest. Eventually, he had to stop and sit back down. A coughing fit erupted from Collin's chest as Tony set down the rabbit. He ran for the first aid kit, looking for something that would help with a cough. But there was nothing. He returned and asked what he could do to help.
You came back. That's enough.
Collin attempted to smile.
So, you got yourself a rabbit?
Tony grinned.
I got us a rabbit.
Tony had learned a little about cooking from his mom before the world turned to crap. Not necessarily rabbit, but he figured it could not be much different. He diced the meat and scrounged the cabinets for any kind of seasoning. There was a bit of salt, pepper, and maybe a sprinkle or two of basil. It wouldn't be much, but it would add a little flavor to the pot. It boiled over the fire as Tony detailed his hunting trip. Collin smiled as he listened to every detail. He was glad his friend was safe. They shared the meat and broth, the warmth of it easing Collin's throat. It was the first time they felt full in a couple of months. The two of them had not had meat since before the snows. With their bellies full, they huddled by the fire again. Tony pulled out one of the books he had acquired along the way, Alice in Wonderland, and began reading. Collin would normally tell him to brush up on something useful, but he felt the boy had earned something more upbeat. He laid there against the couch until he fell asleep. Tony shook Collin violently.
Wake up, Collin.
Collin groggily responded,
What the hell? What's wrong?
There are wolves outside.
That's not possible. Wolves don't live around here.
Collin responded while trying to go back to sleep. Then he heard a very distinct howl. Collin jolted upright, dashing towards the window. Tony trailed close behind him. In the inky darkness, they discerned 3 pairs of gleaming eyes pacing just beyond the tree line. Lured by the scent of Tony's kill, the wolves had followed it back to their cabin. The wolves inched closer, their noses leading them to the doorstep. 2 others prowled around the tiny house, their claws scraping the wooden exterior at random intervals. Collin assumed the scarcity of food was what lured them back to a territory they rarely treaded. With their new discovery of an available meal source, they seemed to have no intentions of retreating. Collin hastily called for his rifle, and Tony promptly handed it over.
How many rounds do we have left?
About 5.
Tony responded, the box rattling in his hands.
Shit, we need to save these. We really didn't need this right now.
Tony apologized quickly, but Collin assured him he wasn't mad. He set the rifle down, instead reaching for his pistol. He knew they had more rounds for the pistol, and if used judiciously, it could suffice. Handing Tony another pistol, he suggested they could split the group if they worked together. Tony made his way to the back door, while Collin firmly gripped the front knob. As the door parted slowly, Collin's pistol steadied for aim. One of the wolves turned out of curiosity, only to be greeted with a 9mm bullet. It yelped and retreated back towards the group, while Collin stepped onto the porch. The other 2 wolves had advanced on the house, just as Tony emerged from around the corner. Collin fired 3 shots at one wolf, missing the first 2 due to its speed. The third hit its hip, causing it to stumble but not slow down. Tony lined up his shot, releasing 2 rounds. The first bullet pierced the wolf's shoulder, and the second found its mark between its eyes, putting it down. As the last of the pack continued to advance, Collin fired 2 more shots. The wolf lunged at Collin, causing his shots to miss. He struggled to keep the wolf's gnashing teeth at bay, pressing the barrel of the pistol to the beast's ear. With a final squeeze of the trigger, the wolf fell limp on top of him. Tony shoved the creature to the side, extending a helping hand to Collin. Both men cleaned up the bodies and dragged them away. Upon returning to the cabin, Tony asked the question he had been holding back for a week. He wanted to know their next plan of action, as they were nearly out of food and still a long way from Canada. Collin had nearly forgotten his promise to share his plan before Tony had fallen ill. He rubbed his eyes, reevaluating the plans he had made that morning. Given their recent encounter with the wolves, and the rising aggression of other predators due to lack of food sources, his previous plan didn't seem as solid.
You ever had coffee?
Collin finally broke the silence.
No, but what's that got to do with anything?
Tony responded, his face scrunched up in confusion.
Good, follow me,
Collin said, his face breaking into a smile. Upon their arrival, he had found a half-empty can of Folgers, which he hadn't considered important until now. He emptied the coffee grains into a rag and tied it closed. He boiled the grains, then strained the liquid through another rag. The result was fairly clean, which he poured into 2 mugs. He sat 1 mug across from him and gestured for Tony to sit.
Okay, I don't think we should go any further until this snow clears up.
He suggested, sipping the strong brew.
Maybe even wait until spring.
Tony attempted a gulp, gagging at the bitter taste.
Wow, how do you drink this stuff?
You get used to it?
Collin lied. He had always preferred his coffee with ample sugar and cream, but those were luxuries they no longer had.
So, what do you think? Hang out here and wait for warmer weather?
Sounds fine to me, but we're gonna need food.
Tony responded, grimacing after taking another sip from his mug.
I think I might have an idea about that too.
Collin replied, taking another sip of his coffee.
We still have all these cabins around us, and if there is one rabbit, there is bound to be more. We just have to be more careful next time.
They both agreed to make the campground their home for the winter and spent the next few days searching each cabin. They managed to stockpile their pantry with a variety of canned beans, fruits, vegetables, and dried goods. Then they took to the woods in search of meat. It took a few weeks to gather a reasonable amount of decent food. They transformed the stand-up shower into a meat locker, insulating the walls and filling the bottom with as much ice as they could find. It wasn't perfect, but with a little salt, their meat would stay fresh between uses. They just needed to keep refreshing the ice and restocking their supplies every few weeks. As the weeks passed, they feasted on several rabbits, squirrels, and random rodents. It wasn't ideal, but it kept them fed. They grew more inventive with their recipes to prevent monotony. During the day, they hunted and set traps for predators. At night, they read from a small library of books they had found in the cabins. Most of their literature comprised of magazines, but anything new was a blessing. Collin even set aside time to teach Tony anything he could remember from high school. They had become a family, with their own home.
You don't talk much about your family.
Collin commented one night after dinner.
You never asked.
The boy replied matter-of-factly.
Well, I am now, so...
Tony paused, his gaze drifting into the distance as he dredged up a past he had nearly forgotten. When memories flooded back, he began to narrate his story, reminiscent of one of their books. Tony had come from a broken home. He had never met his father, and his 3 older brothers were the primary providers. Their mother was a heroin addict, and when he was 9, a social worker arrived to remove him and his brothers from their unstable home. The following years saw them shuffled among foster homes, until the fall, when he was separated from his siblings and left clueless about their whereabouts. Collin was on the verge of tears hearing that Tony had been abandoned the day of the fall. The boy had been huddled alone in their basement while the world crumbled above. Emerging from his refuge, he found his recent home destroyed. His foster parents hadn't even called to inform him they weren't returning. Collin hugged his new friend, which sparked tears in Tony as well. Collin made him a promise that he would never abandon him like that, and Tony reciprocated the promise. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale, After the Fall, Part 3, by the talented Locked 334. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness, and that you'll carry a piece of the Fearfile Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fearfile Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification, so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night and stay scared.